While we prepare to hear this matter, I kindly ask you to support the channel by subscribing, giving a like, and mentioning in the comments where you're tuning in from.
In all my years on the bench, I've seen people cry, lie, beg, and fall silent. But that morning, a young woman walked into my courtroom who didn't try to hide her anger at all. And I knew right then this was not going to be a quiet case. It was an ordinary weekday session. A few tired drivers waiting their turn, an elderly couple whispering to each other on the first bench, two young men staring into their phones. The room felt slow, almost sleepy. I was going through the docket. Speeding, expired registrations, one note in front of me that read, excessive speed, argumentative at stop. On paper, nothing special. I remember thinking, the protocol is simple. The person won't be. Then the door opened a little harder than it needed to, and she came in. She was in her early 20s, maybe 22, 23. She didn't drift into the room, she cut into it. The door closed behind her with a soft thud that sounded louder than it was because of the quiet. Her hair was pulled back in a quick, careless way, like she'd tied it while already halfway out the door. Her clothes were expensive, but put on in a hurry, not styled, thrown. It wasn't the look of someone relaxed. It was the look of someone who'd driven angry. Her eyes were red, but not from crying. There was no softness there. It was the redness of someone who'd been fuming for a while. She didn't sit down like others do, testing the bench and settling in. She stayed standing, right at the end of the aisle, shoulders squared, gaze fixed straight on me. Not the look of a person asking for understanding, the look of a person confronting an obstacle. Before I could say a word, she gave me the first piece of her story. This is ridiculous. My dad is the police chief. She threw that line out like a shield and a weapon at the same time. No explanation of what happened. No, Your Honor. No context. Just the title. Just the connection. As if that alone should move the case from the realm of rules into the realm of favors. The courtroom went very still. A few heads turned, but no one spoke. Silence can be loud when everyone is thinking the same thing. In that moment, I understood where a lot of what I was seeing came from. She wasn't just angry about a ticket. She was offended by the idea of being here at all. But as she stood there, something else caught my attention. Her voice was sharp, but her hands were not. She was gripping the strap of her bag so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Her fingers were trembling just a little. Not theatrical shaking, just that fine, involuntary tremor that lives somewhere between fear and frustration. I thought to myself, this isn't confidence. This is fear wearing confidence as a mask. She stayed on her feet, even when there was a seat open right behind her. Refused to take that small step back. That, too, told me something. People who won't sit down are usually people who feel they can't afford to relax, even for a second. So I watched her, the anger in her eyes, the tightness in her jaw, the hands that didn't match the voice, and I knew we weren't just going to talk about miles per hour. We were going to talk about what happens to a young person who grows up believing one name can stand between them and consequence. I picked up her file again while she stood there gripping that bag strap like it was the only solid thing in the room. On the cover, it looked like 100 other cases I've seen. Speeding, failure to comply, notes from the officer. But the details under that heading were not routine. She'd been stopped doing 23 miles over the limit in a residential area. Not on a highway, not on an open stretch of road, on a street lined with small houses, parked cars, and a playground off to one side. It was a Friday evening. Families outside, kids cutting back and forth across the sidewalk. The hour of the day when people are tired but still moving around. The officer's report was short, but it spoke volumes. Driver argumentative, refused to cooperate at first, eventually took the ticket, stated, "You'll regret this." I remember thinking, speed is one kind of danger, attitude is another. That neighborhood isn't wealthy. It's the kind of place where people sit on porches, talk to their neighbors, yell at their kids to look both ways, the basic defenses ordinary people have against bad luck. They don't have private driveways or wide streets. What they have is a speed limit and the hope that people respect it. My father used to say, a car is the most responsibility most folks will ever own. It's a shame they forget that the minute they turn the key. His words came back to me as I looked from the file to the young woman in front of me. I turned a page and saw something that changed the way I looked at the case. This wasn't her first time. Over the past 12 months, she'd been cited twice before for similar speeding in similar areas. Both times, the disposition line read the same. Warning issued. No fine. No hearing. No consequence beyond a conversation on the side of the road. Somebody had already tried leniency. Twice. And judging from her entrance, it hadn't been received as mercy. It had been absorbed as confirmation that the rules were negotiable. Before the session started, one of the officers had approached my bench quietly after other matters were done. He didn't complain. He just gave me context. Judge, he said gently, during the stop, she kept repeating that we'd regret putting this through. Not a direct threat, but you know. I did know. Everyone who works in this system learns to recognize those phrases. They live halfway between entitlement and intimidation. Now, standing there in my courtroom, she still had that edge in her voice, but something in her posture had shifted. When I asked her formally to state her name and address for the record, she answered quickly, "Yes, Your Honor," and for the first time I heard something besides anger. The words were respectful, almost too respectful, like she'd rehearsed how to sound compliant without ever having to feel it. Her shoulders dipped to fraction when she said, "Your Honor." It was a small movement, but in a room like mine, small movements are loud. I asked if she understood why she'd been summoned instead of receiving another warning. She stared at me for a moment and then said, "Because the officer overreacted." The tone was flatter now, less fiery, but still deflecting the responsibility outward. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I watched her eyes. They flicked toward the back of the room where a couple of uniformed officers sat, then back to me, her jaw clenched, then released. She was weighing something, maybe her father's role, maybe the idea that his position would somehow enter this room like a shadow at her back. But that's the thing about a courtroom. Shadows don't testify. People do. In that pause, I felt the contrast sharpen. Out on the street, she'd been loud, combative, name-dropping her father. Here, faced with a bench instead of a patrol car, her volume had dropped, but the fight inside her hadn't decided whether to quiet down or flare up. I thought to myself, she's used to pushing against uniforms. She doesn't yet know what it means to be weighed by a robe. So I closed the file, folded my hands, and looked straight at her, not as the police chief's daughter, not as a difficult driver, but as a very young person standing at a fork in the road she couldn't yet see. And I knew the next questions I asked weren't just going to be about how fast she was going. They were going to be about who she thought she was when nobody could pull strings for her. I asked her to walk me through the stop in her own words. People reveal themselves when they retell events, not through the facts, but through the choices they make in describing them. She lifted her chin, as if preparing for a performance she'd given many times before. "I was barely speeding," she began. "Everyone does it. The officer singled me out." Her voice had steadied, but her hands betrayed her. She shifted her weight, tapped her thumb against the strap of her bag, then tightened her grip again. Small movements, but to my eye, each one a sentence her mouth refused to say. I leaned back slightly. "You were clocked at 23 miles over the posted limit," I said evenly. "That's not a marginal case." Her eyes flashed with irritation, and she cut in too quickly. "Those radar guns aren't always accurate. and she stopped herself mid-sentence, caught between blaming the device or the human. He didn't even tell me why he stopped me, she finished weakly. That was the first crack, not in her story, but in her confidence telling it. I opened the report again, slowly enough that she could hear the paper move. The officer's body camera recorded the exchange. He explained the reason for the stop at the beginning of the encounter, twice. A soft murmur traveled across the benches behind her. Not judgment, recognition. In small courtrooms, the truth has a way of settling over people like a change in air pressure. She swallowed hard, then redirected. He was rude. He talked down to me. The officer, seated quietly a few feet away, remained composed. He didn't sigh, didn't shake his head. He simply waited. I've learned that officers who know their reports are airtight don't need to defend themselves. They let the facts do it. When I turned to him and asked whether he wished to clarify anything, he spoke calmly. "Your Honor," I approached respectfully. Before I finished my sentence, she said, "Do you know who my father is?" I explained the violation and asked for her license and registration. The room stilled. Her shoulders stiffened, her jaw tightened. She blinked more rapidly, a sign of someone trying to hold a line that's already slipping. I didn't react right away. I let the silence work. Finally, she snapped it with a sharp, brittle voice. "This is harassment." But the force of the outburst wasn't anger. It was panic wearing anger's clothes. It didn't rise from conviction. It rose from fear. Fear that her usual shields weren't going to work here. Her face flushed, then paled. She tried to steady herself, but her breath hitched slightly. I'd seen that look many times. The moment a person realizes they've stepped off the familiar script and don't know how to improvise. I asked gently, "Harassment, because you were asked for your license?" Her eyes darted toward the door. For a moment, I wondered if she was imagining her father walking in, ending all this with one authoritative sentence. But the door remained closed, and reality held her where she stood. She took a step back, not physically, but emotionally. Her voice dropped half an octave. "No, he escalated it. Another contradiction. Another thread pulling loose from her version." I opened the body camera transcript. "The recording shows you raised your voice first. You refused to hand over your license until he repeated the request. You told him, quote, 'Write the ticket. I don't have time for this.'" A few people in the audience looked down, not wanting to stare but unable to hide their understanding of what was unfolding. Courtrooms expose people gently or brutally, depending on whether they fight the truth or walk toward it. She rubbed her forehead with the back of her hand, her composure slipping faster now. "I was stressed," she said softly. "I was having a terrible day." No, that was the first real thing she'd said all morning. A terrible day can make a person impatient, sharp, careless. It doesn't make them speed 23 miles over the limit or drop their father's title like a weapon, but it explains the trembling, the exhaustion behind her eyes, the desperation that was starting to replace the indignation. I nodded once, acknowledging the humanity without excusing the behavior. "Bad days don't exempt us from responsibility," I said quietly. "In fact, they test it." Her gaze fell to the floor, not dramatically, not for effect, but because she couldn't hold mine anymore. That was the moment she began to crumble, not with a shout this time, but with silence. And silence, in my courtroom, speaks louder than any outburst. She had reached the edge of her practiced defenses. The next moment, the moment I could feel gathering like a storm just beyond her, was going to reveal who she was when she could no longer rely on privilege, attitude, or excuses. And the room sensed it too. We were all waiting for whatever truth her next breath would bring. I remember the exact moment when the air in the room shifted. She had been unraveling slowly contradictions, trembling hands, rising voice. But what happened next wasn't a slip, it was a breach. Right after the officer finished his calm, measured explanation, she exploded. Not raised her voice, not protested, she exploded. "You're all protecting each other. This is a setup," she shouted, stabbing the air with her fingers as if accusing the entire room. It wasn't anger at a ticket anymore. It was an attack on everyone in uniform, everyone seated behind her, on the very idea of fairness, the kind of cry that isn't about justice at all, but about drowning out a truth she wasn't ready to face. A woman in the second row flinched. Someone further back pulled their child a little closer. Even the officers, trained to stay composed, stiffened a bit. And I remember thinking, people don't scream like that when they're right. They scream like that when they're afraid the truth is about to corner them. I didn't answer her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't bang the gavel. I simply let the echo of her words fade through the room. You could feel the sound sink into the walls and then the silence return heavier than before. When the moment was right, I raised my hand. No sudden gesture, just enough for everyone to see. The silence deepened so quickly, it felt like someone had turned off the oxygen. "Young lady," I said, my voice low, calm, deliberate. "You're not on the side of the road anymore. This is a courtroom, and here yelling only makes things worse." Her eyes widened. For the first time, there was no fire behind them, only a flicker of confusion, almost childlike, as if no one had ever spoken to her that way, without fear or apology. Her breath caught. She seemed to shrink inward just a little. That is the moment entitlement usually breaks, not when you confront it with anger, but when you meet it with a wall of stillness it can't push through. She sat down suddenly, heavily, as though the weight of the room had finally settled onto her shoulders. The shift in her posture was unmistakable. The facade of control had cracked, and she no longer knew how to stand behind it. I asked one simple question, because sometimes a person needs the smallest doorway to step out of their own performance. "Did you break the speed limit?" There was no immediate reply. She stared at her hands, at the floor, at a spot on the table that seemed to absorb all her attention. A beat passed, then another. When she finally spoke, the word came out as faint as a confession whispered in church. Yes, no theatrics, no excuses, just the truth, stripped of every layer of anger she had wrapped around it. A few people in the audience exhaled, not triumphantly, but almost sympathetically, as if relieved she had finally found a piece of honesty to stand on. Her driver in the back lowered his eyes, perhaps grateful that she had stopped fighting ghosts. And inside myself, I heard my father's voice again, that steady wisdom he carried everywhere. The moment a person admits the truth, frank, even a hard truth, that's the moment they can finally grow. She wasn't growing yet, but the soil had cracked, and something real was finally, painfully starting to show through. The room waited to see what she would do next. And so did I, knowing the hardest part wasn't the word she had just said. It was everything that honesty would demand from her now. I leaned back slightly, giving the room a moment to settle after her admission. Emotional storms don't pass instantly, they leave a kind of drifting fog, and in that fog, truth finally becomes visible. I asked the officer to play the audio from his body camera. He nodded, tapped the device, and the small speaker filled the courtroom with a crisp, clinical recording. First, his voice, calm, steady. "Ma'am, the reason for the stop is your speed. You were then," her voice cutting him off sharply. "I know why you stopped me. My dad is the chief. Don't you dare." There was no yelling on the recording, no dramatics, just a clipped tone of superiority, as clear as a fingerprint. The courtroom wasn't hearing emotion, it was hearing evidence. When the audio ended, the silence that followed was almost reverent. Evidence has a way of washing the room clean of speculation. It doesn't argue, it doesn't waver. She kept her eyes down, her shoulders slumped inward. The fight that had been roaring inside her for 20 minutes evaporated in an instant. Not because she lost, but because she finally recognized the truth was undeniable. Her voice when it came, was barely louder than the hum of the air vents. I panicked. I didn't think this would go this far. There was something brittle in her tone, not self-pity, but the sound of someone who'd spent too long hiding behind a name instead of learning how to stand on their own. I watched her closely. For the first time since she entered my courtroom, she didn't look angry. She looked young. Then, unexpectedly, she added something that changed the air in the room. A second time, softer, more vulnerable than anything she'd said before. Everyone expects me to be perfect because of who my father is. I don't always know how to handle that. A quiet shift rippled through the audience, not sympathy, not absolution, but recognition. Pressure wears different clothes on different people. Some carry it quietly, some crumble loudly. I remembered my father telling me once, when I was a boy, nervous about disappointing him. Being under a shadow doesn't mean you have to live in it. And I thought, she's been standing in someone else's shadow for so long, she's forgotten where she actually ends and it begins. A man in the back row, an older gentleman who had been watching the entire exchange with the calm eyes of someone who's seen life from many angles, spoke up gently. "Thank you, Judge, for keeping this fair." He didn't say it triumphantly. He said it with the quiet gratitude of a citizen who just witnessed equality, not spectacle. Fairness doesn't always look kind. Sometimes it looks like a mirror a person has avoided their entire life. When it was time for my decision, I kept my voice even. "The court finds you responsible for the violation. You will pay the full fine. Additionally, you are ordered to complete a certified safe driving course. Your record will reflect this incident. Any future violation of this nature will carry enhanced consequences. No drama, no sermon, no humiliation. Justice doesn't need a spotlight, it needs a spine." She absorbed every word silently, a stark contrast to the girl who had burst through my doors earlier. Her hands rested quietly in her lap now, fingers interlaced, knuckles no longer white from strain. I could see it settling in her, not the punishment, but the responsibility. For the first time, she wasn't fighting it. As I concluded, I thought to myself, this is what a courtroom is for. Not to break someone, but to stop the break from spreading into their life any further. And though she didn't say another word in that moment, her stillness told me more than any speech could. She had finally stopped running from the truth, from herself, from the shadow of her father's position, even if only for a moment. Sometimes that moment is all a person needs to change direction. I watched her stand, gathering her bag with a care I hadn't seen from her before. No sharp movements, no theatrical sighs, no final attempt at reclaiming control. Just a quiet, almost tentative composure. She paused at the end of the table, as though debating whether to say anything at all. Then, in a voice so different from the one that first filled my courtroom, she said, "I'm sorry for how I acted, not to the officer, not to the audience, to the room itself, to the process she had tried so hard to bend, and perhaps, in some quiet corner of her heart, to herself." The reaction in the courtroom was subtle but unmistakable. People eased back into the benches. Someone exhaled softly, as if relieved on her behalf. Even the officer gave a small nod, not of forgiveness, but of recognition. Moments like this remind me that a courtroom isn't only a place of judgment. Sometimes it's the first place a person tells the truth out loud. She left with her head lowered, not in shame, but in thought. The door closed behind her without the force it had when she arrived. And just like that, the room returned to its natural rhythm, as though a storm had finally passed. Weeks went by. Cases came and went. Loud ones, quiet ones, predictable ones. Her case became another file on my shelf, but not one I forgot. Some people occupy your memory not because of the severity of their actions, but because of the shift you witness inside them. Months later, I received a short note from the administrators of the mandated driving course. She completed all requirements, participated fully, no issues. No elaboration, no dramatics, a simple confirmation that she showed up and did the work. It would have ended there, but one afternoon among the usual stack of mail I found a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in a careful hand. Judge, thank you for treating me like everyone else. I didn't realize how much I relied on my father's name until the day it couldn't protect me. It was painful, but it was necessary. I'm learning to stand on my own. No signature, just a closing period that felt like a beginning rather than an end. I sat with that letter for a long while. Behind every outburst, every moment of arrogance, every defensive word, there is always a story people haven't learned how to tell yet. Sometimes it leaks out as anger, sometimes as fear, and sometimes, very rarely, it returns to you months later in the form of accountability. A few weeks after the letter arrived, I noticed a familiar face in the back row during another hearing, an elderly man who had spoken that day, thanking me for fairness. As he left, he gave me a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey we had both witnessed. It was the kind of gesture that stays with a judge more than any headline or statistic. When I think back on that case now, I don't remember the shouting. I remember the silence that followed it, the moment she stopped fighting the world and finally confronted herself. And as I often do, I think of my father's old wisdom, the kind carved not from books, but from life. Fairness isn't about punishment, Frank. It's about giving a person the chance to walk out better than they walked in.